thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's quite an honor to be among such a prestigious and scholarly group and to join you here in this obviously very spirited conversation. Now, what I'd like to do today is to talk a bit about not just the dangers of technology, but also some of the benefits, and see if we can find a way to find balance in all of this discussion. Just also some of my disclosures and potential conflicts of interest. Now, one of the points I'd like to make is that the technology is not only changing our lives, it's changing our brains, and I'll show you some data to back that up. And the young person's brain is particularly sensitive to what technology is doing. It's also the most exposed, and we've heard about these terms, the digital natives, digital immigrants. We'll delve into that a bit. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that we have a brain gap that is similar to the so-called generation gap. And one goal would be to, I think I just lost, there we go. One goal would be to bridge that brain gap, and I'll show you how we might be able to do that. But before I get into that, I want to begin with an experiment. I want to ask each of you to participate in this and to make the point that our relationship with our technology, it's not just about our brains, it's a very personal experience. So, you know, I'm used to getting informed consent when I do these experiments. You don't have to engage in it if you don't want to, if it's too stressful. But remember, I'm a board-certified psychiatrist. Dr. Spitzer is also here. If anybody gets too anxious, we're at hand. So what I want you to do is check your smartphone. Take a look at it. It's probably, when I used to do this experiment, I would say turn it on. But I think many people already have it on. But just take a look, see if there's any new posts, anything that interests you, and ask yourself, emotionally, how do you feel? And chances are you feel pretty good. Now, that's the easy part of the experiment. What I want you to do now is take your phone and hand it to a stranger nearby. Okay, see if you can do that. I hear people getting a little jittery, a little nervous. And now ask yourself how you feel. I don't think you feel so good. You're kind of worried. Is that person going to see some personal information? Are they going to wreck my new phone? Will they drop it? You know, it's that experience when you go out to dinner and you realize, my God, I left my smartphone at home, and there's a moment of panic, right? But if you can allow yourself to get over that panic, oh, by the way, you can take your phone back. I don't want anybody to have a panic attack here. It becomes more rewarding. You're more in the moment. You're more experiencing those face-to-face human interactions, which is really quite important. So what's going on with all this? Well, we know that from moment to moment, our brains are experiencing these sensory stimuli. And it's very much like looking at a computer screen. You know, it triggers all kinds of reactions. Or if you're looking at a book, or if you're looking at someone's facial expression, there's all kinds of physiological and emotional responses. Light comes into your eye, it hits the retina, and neurotransmitters and chemical reactions go through the optic nerve. Messages move along neural networks, and it gets to our brain, which is a very specialized organ. And you can see in this cartoon that there are certain areas of frontal lobe, the thinking brain, occipital lobe, our visual cortex, and so forth. So it's a highly organized instrument, and it only weighs 3 pounds. Yet, despite its small size, it is very complex. There are trillions of synaptic connections between these different neurons that communicate information. And we know from different experiments, and these are older experiments using positron emission tomography or PET scanning, where you can see neural activity during a certain mental stimulation. You can see the patterns are different. The warm colors indicate where the brain is active during a certain mental experience. And one is when you hear words, the auditory cortex kicks in. Or if you see words, it's very different. It's going to be our occipital cortex. Or if you say the word, it's yet another area of the brain. So we perceive an image or a sensation, it'll stir an emotional reaction, or it could jog a repressed memory, or trigger an autonomic response, muscular response. And all these bits of information are transmitted across very complex neural networks. And in fact, the image here, it looks like a big plate of pasta or spaghetti, but it's much more integrated and specialized. So the brain, it's a bit like a computer. You have basic programs built in when you're born. There's plenty of room on your brain hard drive, and there are specialized computer circuits like macros. But one very important concept that I think affects what we're discussing today, and that is with these neural circuits and synaptic connections between the cells, when we spend a lot of time in a particular mental experience, the circuits, the specialized circuits that control that mental experience will strengthen. On the other hand, we're going to be neglecting other mental experiences, and the neural circuits that control those experiences will be weakening. And the issue is really pertinent when you think about the young, malleable brain. So young people, you know, they have great brains. They learn quite quickly. They learn languages and musical instruments very readily, more than older people. But there are some negativities to the younger brain. The frontal lobe, the thinking brain, has not quite kicked in yet. So complex reasoning skills have not yet developed. The amygdala, the emotional control center, has not yet kicked in. And we know that empathy skills are learned throughout childhood and adolescence. We also know that there's a process called pruning, which it sounds like what the gardeners do with our bushes. 60% of the synaptic connections between brain cells are pruned away throughout adolescence. So there's a lot of brain development going on very rapidly. The question is, how will all this exposure to digital technology affect that brain development? And to understand that a bit more, we might look at how the brain has evolved over time. And if you look at it, I mean, it's evolved quite a bit, and there have been milestones, major milestones in brain evolution. For example, when our human ancestors first figured out, my God, here's a handheld tool. I can develop this tool. Well, that brought about a very rapid change in brain evolution. So the discovery of the tool led to enlargement of the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, very rapidly in evolutionary years. And that also led to the development of grammatical language and more complex social networks. Very important developments. And the question is, what will happen to our brains with this handheld tool? And the answer comes from what we understand about natural selection, what we learned from Charles Darwin, that genetic variants that adapt best to the environment will be the most likely to survive. And we can see this by the tremendous diversity of the species throughout the globe. So this was the environment our brain was exposed to, something like this in the past. This is our new environment, so what will that do to brain evolution? And it might turn things upside down. And this might be us in the future with very large thumbs from all the texting. Now that gets us into the so-called digital natives, young people who are exposed to the technology very, very much so early in life. They have access to it all the time, at least for now, until there are more restrictions. They spend less time in direct face-to-face human contact. So while their brains are developing, I would argue that they're not getting a chance to develop empathy skills, understanding another person's emotional point of view, and their frontal lobes may not be developing the way we'd like them, so complex reasoning skills may be affected. And this, of course, is debated quite a bit in the popular press. slow down, brave multitasker, and don't read this in traffic. And actually, that's a very real concern about traffic accidents and people who text while they drive. It's equivalent to being drunk on alcohol. Or here's another article about Generation Text. Emailing on the go sends some users into harm's way. And one bit of advice is to walk with your chin at a 45-degree angle so you don't walk into a pole. And actually, some cities have insulation around the trees and the poles so that people don't walk into them while they're walking and texting. Now, what we've seen with all this technology use, it's generating tremendous big data sets. And this was a study that was done almost a decade ago, looking at social networks like Facebook, how it spreads mood states. So an analysis of emotional content of billions of Facebook updates. This is between 2009 and 2012. They found that on rainy days, negative Facebook posts increased over positive posts, which decreased. And for every sad post generated, 1.3 negative posts were triggered. And for every happy post, 1.8 positive posts were triggered by friends. So it's clearly having an influence. These mood states are spreading. Then we get into the question of technology addiction, which is wrought with some controversy. We'll probably hear more about it as the day goes on. Clearly, it involves a battle within the brain. The dopamine networks that kind of make us feel good and make us want to search for more and more information online. And it's really, you know, what's going on is our brains really crave newness and novelty. That's why we have to keep writing new books and new articles and watch new television shows, because we don't want to see yesterday's news. We want new stuff. And that is tremendously compelling for us as human beings. And so whatever may be a source of addiction or addictive behavior is accelerated with the technology, whether it's gambling, shopping, pornography, virtual games. A recent meta-analysis of the prevalence of internet addiction, as was defined in this study, found that 7% of individuals were addicted in that study. So what is driving this addiction? And one way to try to understand it is from what we know about operant conditioning. That is the principle that a consequence of a behavior will reinforce that behavior. So if you look at just answering your email, or answering your email would be a good experiment as an exercise in operant conditioning. So the average email you open up, it doesn't generate a lot of excitement. It's an ad, spam, or another onerous task for work. And yet you keep opening those emails and looking at them. Why? Because then you get one of these happy face emails. It makes you very excited. That letter to the editor was just accepted for publication. Or your daughter just got engaged to be married, and gets you very excited. As a result of that one exciting email, you keep checking and checking and checking your emails. And that's very compelling. On the other hand, if every email were a happy face, got you excited, it wouldn't be nearly as compelling. Now, a number of years ago, an interesting study was done to look at how technology may affect face-to-face social skills. And in this study, they looked at nearly 200 students, and the participants were ages 17 through 23, and they played video games and then watched a series of calm facial expressions morph. And the participants are asked to identify the emotion during the morphing of the face. So it looks something like this. This was a neutral face, and then it rapidly changed to either an angry face or a happy face. And they looked at the timing of how quickly those students could recognize the faces. Interestingly, there was a happy face advantage. So they could recognize the happiness faster than the anger. But if the students played a violent video game before the task, they lost that happy stage advantage. Now, a few years later, our group at UCLA we used a similar kind of assessment tool to determine what we called emotional intelligence. And in this study, these were 13-year-olds who went away to nature camp. So 6th graders went to nature camp for 5 days where they had no screen time. On average, these 6th graders were getting about 4 or 5 hours a day of screen time. So no smartphones, no TV screens, and so forth. So we did an experiment like that to see how quickly they could recognize the emotional content of a facial expression. We also showed them videos of social interactions so we could test their social intelligence, see how well they understood the context of those interactions. And what we found was what we predicted in our hypotheses, that after 5 days, these children had significant improvement in their emotional and their social intelligence compared to a control group that went on to use their devices. So the good news from that study, at least at this point, if there is damage to human contact skills, it may not be permanent. We may be able to intervene and correct it. We've heard about the issue of technology and attention, and there have been a lot of studies in this area where computer use is associated with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, in elementary school children. Greater than 1 hour of video games played per day will increase these symptoms of loss of attention. It actually is associated with a lower grade point average, so it affects work at school. But it's been difficult in many of these, particularly the earlier studies, to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship. And some individuals will argue if a kid already has attention deficit problems, they're very attracted to the technology and more likely to stay on it. I think it's probably an element of both in the direction of causality. So I see over the years as a practicing geriatric psychiatrist a lot of older people who are concerned about their memory. And this is the generation of digital immigrants who learn technology later in life. They're better at their social skills. They're more resistant to taking on the technology and have some problems with it because reaction time is setting in. They have problems with fine motor control from arthritis and so forth. And they like old school types of technologies like this kind of old cell phone that had a dial. And they ask, is technology weakening my memory? Because they can't remember phone numbers. The reality is that if you worry about your memory, that will worsen your memory. And what people tend to do, they become efficient and they use their devices to remember birthdays or phone numbers. And what we try to do is teach them ways to use memory for names and faces, which can be socially very awkward when they don't recall a name or a face. So we did a study, actually in the popular press you see a lot of debate, is Google making us stupid? And if for the digital natives in the room, I'm just pointing out that stupid is deliberately misspelled. But we did a study we called Your Brain on Google. We wanted to understand what the brain looks like the first time somebody will search online. Now, to do that study, we had to find people who had never searched online, and recruiting them was very difficult. We ended up with an older group, and many like this, congratulations, you're the last person on earth to get an email account. But after that, we were able to identify a dozen middle-aged and older adults who had very little internet search experience, compared them to what we called internet savvy group, the same age, and they only differed in terms of their internet experience. And we put them into an MRI scanner and had them wear special goggles, and we had simulated internet search sites. And what we found, this shows you a compilation of the functional MRI results, which tells you neural activity from moment to moment. And the red areas show you where the brain is working during the particular experimental task. Here we see the red showing what it looked like when the people naive to the internet first searched online. So you see some activity in areas you'd expect that deal with speech and memory and so forth. But when we had the internet savvy people search online, this is what we saw. There was more than twofold increase in neural activity. And we took those naive people, we had them search online for an hour a day for about a week, and we saw significant increases in neural activity. So basically, they learned how to do the task, and it suggests that searching online can be a form of brain exercise. And one way to understand what's going on, if you plot brain activation versus time, anytime we're introduced to an unfamiliar task, we're not quite sure how to engage, what to do about it, whether it's searching online or setting a clock in a new car and so forth. Once we understand the task, there is engagement of the neural circuitry. Now, the other thing that happens, when we get really good at a task, there's less neural activity. And this is important because one of the things we've done with particularly middle-aged and older people is teach them methods to improve their memory. And this is what we find. We find that their function is better, they remember better, and there's less brain neural activation during the task. And there's been some work with different kinds of apps and video games. For example, here's a game that develops working memory. So short-term memory that we use to hold information in mind to solve problems. And they find that when you play this game, it not only improves your short-term memory, but it transfers to your fluid intelligence, so your problem-solving skills improve. Or there are other studies looking at video games that involve keeping a race car on a windy road while there are distracting and informative road signs that either help or hinder the experience. And they find that 70-year-olds can learn to multitask as well as 20-year-olds after training for just a couple of weeks. There are other studies showing improved visual attention and reaction time from some games. And surgeons who play video games make fewer errors in the operating room. So the next time you need elective surgery, don't worry about where the doctor went to school. Ask them how many video games they play each week. Now, there's been, in the United States, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of discussion about social media and its effect on teenagers, particularly teenage girls. And the US Surgeon General came out with this report, a lot of discussion about it. 95% of teenagers, 40% of children, ages 8 to 12, are on social media. There's clearly some benefits. It's a source of connection for youths that are marginalized. It's a place where they can have self-expression and feel accepted, but we've heard about many of the risks today. Exposure to extreme, inappropriate, harmful content, increased loneliness, social isolation. Those who spend 3.5 hours per day have greater symptoms of depression and anxiety, can impair sleep, less physical activity, on and on and on. A third of adolescents report using screens until midnight or later. 2/3 of adolescents are often or sometimes exposed to hate-based content. Some media platforms show suicide and self-harm related content, of course, which is not good, and these kinds of behaviors can spread through the internet. Twenge and colleagues did a study of social media and depression trends, and they looked at the prevalence of clinically relevant depression symptoms in adolescents according to the hours they spend on social media use. And what this graph shows, particularly for girls, there's a very strong connection for the number of hours on the media and the symptoms of depression. So now if you look at some of the patterns, and this was taken from an opinion essay in the New York Times by Michelle Goldberg. In 2021, 60%, and this is in the United States, 60% of high school girls experienced persistent sadness or hopelessness. 25% made a suicide plan. This is in 2021. Now, since 2012, there's been a steady climb in mental illness in these young people. It was slightly increased by the COVID epidemic. You know, there's so much isolation, but it didn't explain all the increased trends. Around 2012, Facebook bought Instagram, and the word selfie entered the popular lexicon. And reported daily use of social media in 2009, less than 60% of 8th grade girls reported daily social media use. In 2014, it was up to greater than 80% reported daily use. Now, we can't prove cause and effect relationships from these correlating trends, but it does raise your eyebrows and cause concern. Another recent article in the New York Times asks the question, does your child have an unhealthy relationship with social media? Now, we've heard that some kids are more sensitive than others, but here's some questions to ask. Participation in diverse and meaningful activities each day, is that going on? Are they playing ball? Are they going to ballet? Is social media the primary emotional outlet? I'm sorry, I'm pausing because the screen here keeps going blank and I didn't memorize my speech. I'm very dependent on the technology to give this speech. How many hours of daily social media use are they engaging in? Many experts recommend no more than 4 hours per day, and this is their expert opinion. We don't really have tremendous data to support these recommendations. Do they have difficulty stopping social media use? Does the child become irritable when forced to stop? And we've heard, and I think this is a very important point, that adults, parents, and teachers need to model the healthy types of behaviors around our media. Is it affecting their sleep, school performance, daily functioning? These are very important questions to ask. There was another recent study looking at screen time and brain structure development. Now, a moment ago, I said, well, the study we did with the kids who went to nature camp, it didn't seem to be permanent damage, but this study, I don't know, raises some concern. Here, they're looking not at functional MRI, but structural MRI, so looking at the actual volume of the brain in different regions. And they had 9 and 10-year-olds who had high levels of screen use, and that was associated with mood disorders and aggression. The brain structure patterns in these children were similar to those associated with underage drinking in previous studies. Now, they followed these kids for a couple of years, and when they turned 11 and 12, the children continued to have depression and anxiety that was related to the heavy screen use, and their brains had changed in ways that would explain some of these mood disorders. And you see some of the brain regions from these images from that paper. So going back to the U.S. Attorney General, his report came up with some ways to make social media safer. And he addressed lots of different groups in this report. First, policymakers suggested strengthening safety standards, limit access to make social media safer for children, protect children's privacy, support digital media literacy, and to fund research. Technology companies, they need to assess the impact of their products on children, share the data to increase understanding of the impacts, make design and development decisions that prioritize safety and health. For example, protect the child's privacy and better adhere to age minimums. For parents and caregivers, establish tech-free zones to protect sleep, encourage in-person relationships, teach responsible online behavior, and again, to model that behavior. For children and adolescents, to adopt healthy practices like limiting time on platforms, blocking unwanted content, being careful about sharing personal information, and teaching them how and when to reach out for help, particularly when they're concerned about bullying and harassment and abuse. And then for researchers to prioritize social media and youth mental health studies that support the establishment of standards and evaluation of best practices. Now, we've heard a bit about this already, about lifestyle habits that affect the brain, and that in some studies it suggests that it can actually be a greater impact than genetic factors. And this is important because when we're spending time sitting in front of a computer or watching a television or just fiddling with our smartphones, we're not getting out and doing healthy things. We're distracted about that. And there are a number of these strategies, and I'll just touch on them briefly. We've heard about them already. We've talked about mental stimulation, stress management is another one, physical conditioning, healthy nutrition, staying social and connected, getting enough sleep, and so forth. We did a study a few years ago with Gallup, which does these huge surveys in the United States, and we had over 18,000 U.S. Individuals ages 18 to 99. And this is the first time that Gallup asked about memory and healthy lifestyle. Not surprisingly, we found that complaints about memory increase with age. We know that. We've known it for years. But notice 14% of young people are complaining about their memory. And it may be a different process from what you're seeing in older adults who have other cognitive challenges from the brain getting older. I think a lot of it may have to do with the unhealthy lifestyles they're living, as well as the distraction from their devices. Healthy behaviors are more common in older adults, which makes sense because if you have an unhealthy behavioral lifestyle, you're unlikely to live to old age where you could answer the phone for one of these surveys. But the other thing that was quite compelling is that the more healthy behaviors a person engaged in, the better their memory or the fewer their memory complaints. And it was an additive effect. So if somebody exercised regularly, their memory was better than if they didn't. If they exercised regularly and consumed fresh fruits and vegetables and didn't smoke cigarettes, it was even better. Now, another thing that we can do, we can train people at any age, although most of the training has been done in middle-aged and older people, with techniques to compensate for age-related memory decline. By age 45, the average person has a significant drop in their objective memory performance. So we teach simple techniques like look, snap, connect. Look is a reminder to focus attention. The biggest reason people forget is they're simply distracted. Snap is a reminder to create a mental snapshot of what you want to remember. That leverages the brain's natural visual spatial skills. And connect is a way of linking or associating those mental snapshots so they have meaning. If something's meaningful, it will be memorable. So if you meet Harry, you notice he has a lot of hair. Or if you meet Mrs. Bangle, you notice she has bangs, and she may tell you that she's an attorney, and you find out her first name is Sue, so that reminds you of her first name. And these kinds of techniques you can get in books or in games and puzzles and apps and so forth, and they've been developed quite extensively. In fact, the health system where I lead psychiatry right now, we're creating an innovative digital mental health center where we're going to have engineers and scientists who are working on different apps and games to benefit mental health, where they take evidence-based therapy, other kinds of tools for measuring mental states, put them into games, put them into apps, and it can help people of all ages, and also assists in access to care. But what they're doing it in a very serious way, different from what companies tend to do, where it becomes commercialized and they don't really look at the science. Here, they're doing it in a way where they show that these devices and programs actually make a difference. And here's an example of how non-pharmacologic interventions for cognitive difficulties can help with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So this was a meta-analysis of the neuropsychological effects of various interventions between 1980 and 2017. They looked at 18 studies, and the interventions included neurofeedback, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive training, and even physical exercise. Interestingly, physical exercise had the biggest benefit in terms of cognitive health, but benefits were observed for attention, inhibition, flexibility, and working memory. And there were medium to large effect sizes of improvement across interventions. So the effect size just means the impact of the intervention versus a sham or placebo intervention. So with physical exercise, we probably have the most compelling evidence. You don't have to become a triathlete to protect your brain health from physical exercise. Just 30 minutes of brisk walking a day has been shown to grow the size of your brain, the hippocampus in particularly, which is underneath the temporal lobe and is an important memory center. We did a study looking at a surrogate of physical exercise, the amount of time people spend sitting each day. And this, I think, is particularly relevant if we're talking about digital technology. And what we found was a highly significant correlation between the size of the medial temporal lobe, the very critical memory center in the brain, and the number of hours that people reported sitting. So some people now are starting to work with standing desktop stations or even treadmills where they walk very gradually while they work on their computer. Nutrition is very important for brain health. Overweight and obesity increase the risk of cognitive decline. Consuming enough omega-3 fats from nuts and fish, antioxidant fruits and vegetables, and avoiding processed foods. These are very important ways to feed the brain and protect it. Stress is not good for brain health. Chronic stress in animal studies and human studies leads to impaired memory and brain atrophy. If you inject a young volunteer with cortisol, a stress hormone, causes temporary memory impairment. But meditation, relaxation can alter neural circuitry in the brain, as you see from these functional MRI studies. And it also improves mood and cognition. Now, we heard about the Lancet Commission and the importance of these modifiable risk factors in terms of protecting brain health. And that kind of brings us just to a summary of the associated risks and potential benefits of the digital technology. So in terms of risks, it can worsen cognitive deficits, can be associated with physical inactivity, and we've heard about how bad that is for brain health. Social isolation, despite the fact that people are using the social media so extensively, many of them feel isolated. They feel left out. They feel less than because everyone on social media is posting the best side of themselves. Poor sleep, a variety of mental health issues. On the positive side, the benefits. These programs that many have been working on can enhance cognitive abilities. As I mentioned, you can have greater access to healthcare as a result of telehealth. It can increase social connectedness. We certainly saw that during the COVID pandemic, where thanks to video conferencing, people could continue various relationships and even their business lives. There are novel measures of health that we don't have time to get into, and innovative treatment modalities. So where do we go from here? I think we can think about several things. I think we need to emphasize offline brain training. We've seen from I've shown you some studies about how interaction with technology changes neural activity in the brain. Well, it turns out talking with people, even psychotherapy of different forms, will change neural wiring in the brain. So encouraging people to spend time offline is very important. Different quality of interaction. And we want to innovate with the technology. I mean, there's so many things that we can do to use this technology to enhance our lives. As others have said, we want to find time offline to improve our real-world experiences. And to summarize, I would again say to you, technology is not only changing our lives, it's changing our brains. But I am convinced that we can find balance by improving technology and social skills and knowing context, when to use them, when does it make sense. I think it's important to encourage conversations about technology risks and benefits, particularly with young people. We've heard a lot of conversation so far about restricting it and setting limits, and that can work to some extent. We can get better at doing that. I found, my wife and I, we wrote a book about this called iBrain, and we went around to schools all over the country, and we talked about this to parents and kids. And some of the schools, they actually had up to the panel discussion with the teenagers, they had, let's try a day without technology. Well, most of them couldn't get through the day, but it was very interesting to engage them in the discussion. It made a huge impact because they felt they were part of it. I think it had a better impact on them than just restricting it without understanding what's behind it. We can strengthen safety standards, limit access for children, establish tech-free zones to protect sleep, and encourage in-person relations. Thank you very much for your attention.